So I'm here with Robert Lopez, and we are going to talk about one of his favorite singers, my favorite singers, Little Richard. And I guess I'm starting with curious that if your parents were into old rock and roll, if that's something you grew up around, because I know that's a huge thing in Latino culture.
No, I mean, I was aware of it. I grew up with a lot of music, so it wasn't like, here's Elvis, you got to love it, we do. Here's Little Richard, you got to love it, we do. It was always there, surrounding. I mean, there was already oldies culture
Mm-hmm.
in lowriders and Latinos, so it was just something that was there. I don't think I embraced oldies till later, much later, as almost
Mm-hmm.
a
Would that have been like K Earth or like a San Diego station or something you
yeah,
were
there's
coming
San
from
Diego
across?
Station, and then also hearing Art LeBeau from Los Angeles. So
Exactly.
even
I was away.
up to the so that'd be 16. That would be knowing that, but before that, there was always oldies. So it wasn't something that this is great, this is God, pay attention. It was never like that. And so I
Right.
think punk rock pushed it aside. Although, okay, here's your roots to rock and roll, and so I already appreciated. Oh, this is as easy as that. So it wasn't a. But then later I appreciated it more because
Mm-hmm.
appreciating at the time in 55, 56, what a different world that was. And for this music was the punk rock of that period enough to make fear in parents, enough to, you know, do that.
You're so closely associated with Elvis, but oldies music wasn't the first music that you were completely obsessed with, I assume, because you were way into Bowie and New York Dolls and that
Yeah,
kind of stuff.
obsessed was
Maybe.
never the word I would say. I think it was appreciative. But yeah, no, we grew up with Santana, Carly Simon, Dory Previn, Vicente Fernandez, Cumbia, Mariachi, uh, Jose Feliciano, uh, Willie Bobo, Dave Brubeck. So all that was in the house of the records of
Mm-hmm.
my parents. Of
Right.
course, that was all pre 72, and that brought my sisters, Bowie, all that stuff. And there was still Rolling Stones before 72 and all that stuff. But 12 years old is my own Kiss, New York Dolls, Bowie, that stuff. So that's still pretty early in the game.
Right.
But it all came from a basis of knowing the oldies, knowing Elvis, knowing Wooly Bully, knowing Vicente Fernandez, Carly Simon, all that. So very
Mm-hmm.
musical, but it wasn't like a Rufus Wainwright, hey, we're all playing piano now and all that. It was just there as opposed to, remember, this record is God or anything totem like that.
Yeah, I think people assume that since you're so closely associated with them that you must have gone through this wicked Elvis phase. But I know that from you telling me, like, and I can relate because people know you for that more than anything. But you're not. I think or from what you've said, Elvis was just such a great vehicle for you to glom on all this other stuff, and not that necessarily you loved him more
Correct. It
than
was
maybe
an
Little Richard.
art project, but I am a sponge, and so I knew all even before I started doing Elvez. I go, oh, I already know the basics. I know the Sun story, studio stories. I know the classics, post Lisa Marie. I mean Priscilla songs. How his music changed. So all that history I already was familiar with. It wasn't like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, now I'm an Elvis. I gotta study up on my stuff. It was all the history I knew because I know a lot of music as you do history, the
Yeah,
things that you just pick
sure.
up and put down in your Rolodex in your mind.
So was Little Richard just one of, you know, all a ton of bands that you were sort of aware of, but not necessarily loving, or
Did
did
he
he immediately
correct.
speak
And I
to
knew
you?
he was special because he was the inspiration for Bowie, Beatles, and knew of other people I liked that say, oh, I was influenced by him. And
Right.
so I knew he was a cornerstone to the major players being Bowie or Beatles in my psyche of music.
Did you immediately identify him because he was just so flamboyant and he was more your thing than Elvis was in a lot of ways?
I knew he was more dangerous than Elvis, and so that is to me more. And I knew he was more glam than Elvis,
Sure.
so I knew he was a Bowie inspiration. He was closer to Bowie than Elvis was to Bowie,
Sure.
so I knew
Yeah,
that, and I knew the
absolutely.
theatrics of that, and again the word danger of what is more. on the edge or what is more socially acceptable.
Mm-hmm. So you become a teen, you start playing music, and that early kind of punk is definitely influenced by a lot of garage and early rock and roll. Would you say like the Zeros more than maybe other bands, the group that you were in when you were a teen? There's so much made of, early punk was a throwback to 60s garage. So like you've got the Ramones and Jonathan Richman and all that. Were you part of that?
Yeah, we weren't thinking about Little Richard or Elvis, which at 1976, 16-year-old, you're supposed to think we are inventing something new. We are part of a new generation, which is all looking back and say, oh, look at all your influence. And so, I mean, you're allowed to do that at 16, I
Sure.
think. Think you're,
Sure,
as
sure.
opposed to the Rolling Stones think, look at how different we're playing the blues. And I go, it's like, you're just spinning the wheel in a different direction, perhaps. You're not reinventing, which I think it's good for a teenager to feel that. They'll wisen up
Yeah.
later.
Well, looking back in 1978 is so different from looking back now. We've talked about it so much, how the world changed so much that what was nostalgic for 15 years before was in a whole other world, whereas now 15 years ago doesn't really matter.
But as in Elvis too, singing Blue Moon of Kentucky and hopping it up and speeding it up, changing it from country music to rockabilly was a jab at the establishment in a young man's version of punk rock of 1955 when he was doing
Sure.
Blue Moon. So what is this guy? No respect for music, and the kids love it because it's something new and fresh. And every generation hopefully will have this is something new and fresh, although it has many roots from all over.
Mm-hmm. So 10 years after you do the Zeros, or so, you start doing Elvis, and suddenly you're steeped in oldies
World. I
Yeah.
mean,
you know it like the back of your hand, so it's great to be able to pull from all this different stuff.
As you work, I mean, I think Elvis is just fanboy on display. So it's like saying all the things I love all at once was and it was also in character of Elvis, of fanboy in my whole life, and I am just like this, and it's also being fanboy of Chicano culture. But musically, it was, these are all the records like, and this record sounds like this record, and this record sounds like this, and their influence, and the idea was to take, it's a big nostalgia thing, but I guess putting together in a new way or do a commentary, be it presidential, spiritual, sexual, whatever, was the other added novelty of Elvis. But it was, steeped in nostalgia, but showing nostalgia in a different way, perhaps.
sure.
But it was just such a great palette for you to be able to throw anything.
Yeah.
You want at it, and you
usually
always
it was,
change it.
Yeah, but usually it was always something that meant something to me. So as people would say, "Oh, you should do that," and I go, "Nirvana never did that to me." So it has to steep in my mental fanboyness to get onto the set list.
Right. So I first saw it in San Francisco, Paradise Lounge, maybe 94, 95. You guys had been doing it for
Maybe like 6-7 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
full band, Elvets, the whole shebang. But I didn't meet you probably for like 6 years or something. I remember I was playing Casbah, and we were both there to see Imperial Teen, who we're both
Friends with.
and my favorite opening line, you said, "I heard you play Spandau Ballet," because I'd done
Done like one little bit.
and I knew you were a big influence on me trying to like work in all kinds of things, and it was great when you were able to you noticed one little thing.
Yeah.
Like now I sometimes tell you I noticed one little thing that no one else has noticed. So I totally appreciate we were kindred spirits and started talking a lot.
Tell me how you first met him. I heard you recently talking about your time working at the Hyatt, the famous Riot House in Hollywood. But I didn't really hear how you ended up working there.
I had a friend who worked in room service, and he was a friend from San Francisco, and he was a friend of Penelope Houston, friend of Frank, and so all the art type punks. So I had known him for a while. That's Tim Smith. He was a painter himself, but he had also done some paintings of Little Richard, because he would see, I would talk to Little Richard on the phone. He would be the person delivering the food. And so he got to see, I would just talk to Little Richard on the phone. he would come down and he would know me because he said, "Oh, you're little Robert from the thing." And so he was living at the Hyatt at those days, and Hyatt already had its reputation, so it wasn't as super fancy as it might have been. It was slightly rough around the edges. And he was living there, I think, on the 12th floor, and might have had two adjoining suites. He had a whole group of people working with him, handlers, who, when I met him the last time in Spain, he had some of the same handlers, which is, cousins and people who had done, paperwork or whatever for him were doing. So that might have been 80, 81, so something around that.
And that's all you were doing was room service? Was that your
I was a waiter
main
at some
job,
point.
or?
My sister was a waiter at some point too, but I would talk to him just about daily. He would have photo shoots. He would always have some young model. Robert, we're doing a photo shoot, so you send up some virgin pigeon coladas. So he was having young, handsome men into his hotel suite. And he would come down sometimes and say hello in person and blah, 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 blah. So it was just a light conversation and daily. So when I met him, and I had done some festivals with him. I've done some festivals with him in Texas, but it was always old lineup, so it was like many bands, so I never got to be in the same room with him. But it wasn't until he honed Spain, a big festival that my friends had put on, and we were staying at the same hotel, and then I saw him in the lobby, and I ventured to talk to him. I go, "Hello, Mr. Richard, you probably don't remember I worked at the Hyatt." He goes, "Little Robert!" Oh, and he gave me a big hug, and he tell me who's dead. And he wanted to, and he goes, "Hey, Jimmy, you remember Little Robert?" And all his friends, "You remember Little Robert, friend of Tim Smith, who did that painting of me?" And so it was great. And luckily, press was there because it was a big rock and roll weekend. And so there's some pictures of us both. And there was a print in the paper, the King and Queen of Rock and Roll reunited in the paper. And so that was a nice thing. And so I watched him play that Saturday, and then that Sunday I homaged and parody all, because he was in his religious period, so he had all these boxes of Bibles that he would toss out. So I kept some of the boxes so I could reenact it, because we were also doing the closing night, and instead of the Bibles I had confetti, and so I was doing all stuff like that.
How'd you feel about that period for him? I know he was a conflicted person, and you obviously can relate to some of the stuff that he was going through, but I never really heard you talk about that.
To me, I mean, because it's a long lineage of people doing that. I mean, look at Al Green, preacher. I mean, being in the church and not of the church is such a prince. Little Richard, they all go through that period, which is great. I think conflict makes great rock and roll, or great art, or great literature, all those things and there is no answer. So it's like the great turmoil is what makes great art sometimes. Not all art has to come out of turmoil, but I think that's how do I express this, and this angst turns out to great music, art, or literature. And in this specific, being the church, secular and non-secular, it's like you grew up secular, and to me, I was already aware of the history of that. Sister wrote that at Thorpe too. It's just like which is farther back than Little Richard.
It's the devil's music, but you're playing it anyway. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a whole lot of that.
So I was aware of it, and I didn't think of it. I just thought that's part of the nostalgia, or part of the legend of what rock and roll can do to folks.
So at what point did you meet Sparkle? Back when she was still in England, or?
Yeah, 96 perhaps. They were show promoters. They promoted a show, and that was our first show in London. And I had already been touring Europe, but London was a hard market to crack, and she cracked it open for us, and that was one of the most memorable shows, because all the promoters saying, "Oh, he's not big enough here, we can't book him a show," and someone took the chance, and after that the floods opened, and we were playing all the great you know, Brixton Academy and opened for Roy Wood and all this great stuff. But she believed in us, and that show was sold out. People were scalping tickets for £100, and it was just like the perfect audience. Everyone dressed up, and it was a really great thing. I think very
That's
much.
so great.
And we've known of each other, but we didn't meet until 96, I guess. But we have all the same friends of early punk rock, and had probably been in the same rooms in New York in '78 without knowing it, because we have all the same lineage of friends and bands.
So she had I mean made her name as a clothes retailer, like in the glory days, along with Malcolm Sex shop and
She was a little post that she was a manager of the Heartbreakers.
Sure.
Or what call it. So that was
Right.
before the clothing store. So the clothing store was that. But in our Little Richard's back of the 45, because we named it up, shot the cover of The Girl Can't Help It on front. It was like, to me, it's like, oh, in the lineage of Sex and Let It Rock, or in LA Poser, and the stores of rock and roll always had a boutique of clothes, Granny Take a Trip, all the stuff. And so that was our tribute to them, being part of that heritage of, and here's the music, and here's what you wear to listen to that music.
right. So she moves to America and decides to move to San Diego, where you grew up, and opens a shop called The Girl Can't Help It, which of course is a Little Richard song. And did you play the opening? Is that what it was, or was it a 1 year anniversary? Maybe
I did an year anniversary with Pony Death Ride. So the
Right.
three of us did the second. I think it might have been the second year. She said, "Oh, can you put something together for us?" And I guess I was already friends with the Schizophonics then, so we said, "Sure, we'll put up together the Little Richards." And the concept of, it was an all-star lineup where everyone's a lead singer, so we could do round robin. Hi, my name is Little Pat. There's a song by Little Richard. Next person, hi, I'm Little Brian. And it was all polka dots and two-tone shoes and choreographed dance movements and wildness. And it was meant as a one-off, as me and Pat always make these one-offs, and then surprisingly one-offs go on tour. The great thing of that, we played that night. The club said, "You're so great, can you play at our club tonight?" We did. Third show we did, I forget where it was, but then Sympathy said, "Oh, my daughter loves you. I'll sign your records. I haven't even seen you guys, but my daughter knows." And we put out the record. And then by our seventh show, someone said, "Oh, we'll give you a tour of Europe and Italy." And by our 11th show, which you were playing,
Right.
because we did a band lineup change because we were doing the tour, we were playing in front of 1,000 people in a festival in Zaragoza, and no one had even seen us or probably heard of us before, but it went over so well. It was like you were there. It was like,
Yeah. Had you had any idea to do that before, or was just the name sparked the idea to have a Little Richard cover band, and you went from there? Or in the back of your mind, had you always thought it'd be kind of fun to do a set of Little Richard covers? Is that
no,
not even
me
part
and
of it?
Pat, we like to bounce ideas off each other, so I can't remember exactly when it was, but it just, we said, because the name of the store was The Girl Can't Help It, so somehow that came in, so we said, let's do something easy, but of course, we took the songs and deconstructed them, or, made them more and made everything, because the thing about Little Richard and oldies rock and roll and blues, if you do it poorly, it just can be such a drag. And I've seen so many terrible blues bands and so many nostalgia bands. Unless you know that secret of oomph, it's just going to be boring. And so the main thing was they cannot be that lag and just doing, it's got to be the energy and find the secret. And much of Little Richard's stuff is repetitive, so the secrets of show business, of using different keys, different tempos, putting stops, whatever you can do, and then also the glory of having, okay, here's a new singer who brought it all, their different energies, and so it was planned in a Ramones-esque idea of here's the frame, leather jackets, jeans, 2-minute songs, blah, 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 so we made a frame and said within this frame we can do whatever we want, but this is all we do. And so it was like an art project of sorts.
Yeah. I'd seen it a couple of times and loved it. So for you guys to ask me to come along was just dream come true in some ways. I'd always wanted to be in one of your bands, but I'm not enough of a musician. But those kinds of songs I could almost sort of handle. So
and they're trickier too because it's not always as easy as you think, but they are easier if you play them crappy. But if you do the original bass line or all this stuff, so it's a tricky thing. It can be boring as hell or raised to high form of art, which I think we were trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And lucky me, you'd ask everybody in town and nobody else could take 3 weeks off. And I was like, hell yes. So yeah, we did 3 weeks in Spain and Italy. And then I was going to ask, like, what do you remember most? And I'm glad you mentioned Zaragoza because that was
obviously
that was pretty good. Yes. Pretty silly for a band that had only done 11 shows to do that.
Yeah.
And yeah, some of those shows were really great because I remember the promoter said everyone, even the bartenders, was watching this. Everyone stopped to watch the show because me and Pat on stage can be, and it was the band dynamics where you are not working unless you leave the stage drenched.
Yeah.
And in the early days of that, it was like a challenge to each other, and also it was like, okay, follow next band, try to follow that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had to be careful because I had never played like that before and had choreography and all this. So it was, I felt like
the weak link, if only because you guys could go crazy.
You were!
And I totally. It was so much fun though. I mean, what a blast. And when was the last time you even did it? It's been a few years now, I think.
Yeah. I tried to do a version of it in Seattle called it the New Little Richards, and we did a couple shows, and it was fun. And then I was contemplating it, a Mexican version, Los Nuevos Little Richards. But yeah, I don't know if I'll pick it up again, but it is a fun frame, and each version can be a little different, but no plans of reuniting.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was fun to listen to the first record, which I had never owned. I don't know if you remember, I went through a brief. You're actually wearing, is that orange, like your sweatshirt?
Yes.
Oh my God.
So yeah, I went through this weird period where I bought an orange couch and suddenly I had to buy all this orange stuff. And so I bought the record to put on the wall, among others. Were you aware of this being a singular record at all, or did you just know Greatest Hits, like, which is all I ever knew for years before I really knew, like, oh, this was this period?
I think I knew Greatest Hits first before I knew this record. Mm-hmm. So, and this record has still different versions of outtakes and extras, which are nice, but it's just like, oh, to think, because our Little Richards record is almost everything from that.
Yeah, I think it was like 7 out of 11 songs or something like that.
And then it's also weird because there's so many different re-recordings that he did later when he was trying to get his masters, which is so funny because Taylor Swift's album is, I go, oh, and that still happens today. Of someone.
Yeah, he was definitely one of the most first vocal people about I Got Screwed.
Yeah,
you hear the Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, and him, but he was never shy.
And I think the first recordings just always has the more energy of, we're recording this, we're trying to capture the lightning in the bottle. So the original recordings I always prefer because they're great. And these outtakes are great too because they're almost like remixes of, okay, they're playing the piano a little different. So it's like the song but now played in a different way. So all those things I love, but it's the essential.
Yeah, it's crazy how much energy comes from those early
recordings. Definitely. And then again, it's just like, I have a weird thing. It's just like songs like Tutti Frutti or I Want to Hold Your Hand or, Johnny Be Good are in your head, had been played so many times that they've kind of lost their luster. It's just like, them, you know how to play them, in that little breakout, or that little of a weird guitar or whatever. And so those are just the basics, but listening to that record again, I go, oh, well, someone who's never heard this, Tutti Frutti is, if you were, and there's so many kids now that I've worked with, they go, oh, you're not knowledgeable of the whole Kiss catalog. And so things that you take for granted are, Ziggy Stardust, side 2, third song, they go, what? And so a record like Here's Little Richard is that you got to take into account what it sounded like in 1956 hearing
Yeah.
it, which is completely different. And or someone who's not familiar with Little Richard say, oh, well, obviously you have to listen to, Tutti Frutti because the energy is so there. But to me, it's like, oh, I've heard this a million times and I
Sure.
still
And we've heard
appreciate it.
We've heard energetic music that's technically more energetic than this our whole life.
Yeah.
But to put it, to imagine how crazy this would have seemed in 1956 and what a revolution it was, and that people were tearing up movie theaters.
Correct, yes. And the idea
and
that,
concert halls.
like, I Want to Hold Your Hand, we've heard it a million times. And every once in a while, you can say, oh, yes, this is a great song. But it's just like, okay, I'll go to something that I haven't heard. Like, there's other tracks that are not as popular. I go, oh, those are nice to hear because you don't hear them as much as opposed to on all the oldies you would always hear Tutti Frutti or whatever. So it's like those have become memory logs that they're there. And so they don't offer new and shining variants. But they are still great, and especially great for someone who's not attuned to the beauty that is the beauty.
That's one of the most fun things about doing this podcast is we take a record and we rank our favorites. And I'm always shocked by how often the biggest hit, the one I've heard a million times, the one if it came on the radio, I'd skip it, by taking a look at it, a more critical view. I'm like, holy shit, there's all these things. I never really thought too much about, oh yeah, this is great and this is great and this is great. So it was definitely fun to do that with this one, with these songs that I not only heard a lot, but learned to play, which was fun.
And I know you're part of those ranking file people who like to, and I go, I never do that because you change every day and go, oh, I'm in a different period.
Yeah, it's hard for me to do because I'm not one of those people usually. So it's like, it's interesting to make myself use that part of the brain. So did you listen to it on the way back to LA? So we saw each other last night at a show, and I said, "Here's your homework," and I sent him, old Spotify. You didn't have to have a record player in your car. So if you had to choose a favorite, can you do such a thing? Even though, it's not really in your me.
A favorite of today would be probably "Baby," which is like the fourth track or something, just because it's one that you don't hear it too often. If you're going for archival of what's the essential, you take to Mars and tell the Martians this is what we're about, you choose Tutti Frutti, of course.
Sure.
But "Baby" and "True Fine Mama" are weird productions and weird tempos, which I think are great, because if you know vernacular of Little Richard, things can get similar. These two are odd ones. And if you're familiar with the whole catalog, there's a lot of odd ones that he did. And so the odd ones always prick up my ear because I go, oh, you never hear this one. Or, ooh, this influenced another song who would copy these backing vocals later or stuff like that. So, and again, thinking of the time period, this is 56, how these were ahead of the Belmonts, who would later cover a harmony like that for something else. So if you knew your rock and roll history, you could say, oh, these odd ones are pretty great.
Yeah, it was fun to hear those, just because I guess if only for the ones that we did, we're obviously going to be most familiar, but yeah.
And then the outtakes on the Weird Thing, which isn't the original album, are great too, just because there's these little things like odd tempo of a piano, and they're great little things. And all those like Beatles, or whatever they're called, with outtakes and all that stuff. I love all that stuff because it's just another glimpse into what it was, which I tried to do all the time with Elvis. Is like, what if this person was in the room playing that song at the same time? So it's my whole idea of remixing.
Absolutely, right on. Cool. Well, we value your opinion. Thanks for taking some time.
Thank you.
Heading to the airport soon, so thanks for talking to us.
Thank you much. Good luck on your podcast. I am turning this off.